Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
This week, we're going to talk about the new feature in Defender, which is Microsoft Security Exposure Management, otherwise known as XSPM. So another acronym for the acronym soup that we know to be security. And since we're going to be talking about Microsoft security, let's go over our usual disclaimer.
Sure. Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales business. We do this show outside of work on our own time, and we self-fund the show, including our recording platform, our domains, and the ancillary services we use to provide it to you all. Microsoft does not demand or expect editorial control of the show. Andy and I speak from our heart and from our minds and shoot from the hip. However, of course, because there is potential conflict of interest with our employer and the subject we're discussing, we, of course, want our listeners to know that. We aim to discuss things through an academic lens, through facts and figures, and what is demonstrably true or not. But, of course, we want to remain gainfully employed. And of course, we're always going to highlight the positives of the things we do. And, you know, the good thing about Microsoft is it has a very generous social media policy. You are allowed to be critical. And I think we have been from time to time. But when we're discussing just like features and functionality, of course, we're going to highlight the positive benefits of it. And that's what we're going to do today in talking about some new technology and security exposure management.
All right. So security exposure management is something that is coming and is on the horizons for a lot of vendors. Microsoft is one of the few that offer this unified view, especially if you're using the Defender solutions. But I know that other companies like CrowdStrike, maybe Palo Alto, they're looking at also putting together something like this. But essentially, security exposure management is a unified view of your security posture across all of your assets, all of your workloads, all the things that are hooking into Defender, and it enriches that asset information with context that will help you proactively manage attack surfaces, protect your critical assets, and mitigate exposure risks. So before we dive into the details of exposure management, I want to talk about how we got here and really like the evolution of what became exposure management. So really it is the evolution of vulnerability management that got us here. So in the beginning of vulnerability management, we have just, scanning assets, right? Like we were just looking at endpoints and servers really in the beginning. And really as part of that, we're just looking at vulnerabilities that were part of the CVE enumeration, CVSS rating, and we're just looking at patching operating systems. That's pretty much it. Like, here are the vulnerabilities. Let's patch them. Let's reduce the number of vulnerabilities. And that was basic vul management. That evolved into risk-based vulnerability management, where we're looking at more things. We're still scanning and looking at asset discovery, but we're including like mobile devices, maybe identity solutions, IDPs, applications. So now we're looking at the applications that are installed, like maybe Edge or Chrome, other applications that have vulnerabilities that can lead to other things, web traffic. Maybe we're looking at some infrastructure. So like we're expanding our scanning, and then we're looking at other vulnerabilities that pop up like weaknesses. So I would call that like weakness enumeration. Like if there is a vulnerability within your web browser that can then lead to other things, that's a weakness that can be exploited. And we're also maybe looking at contextual prioritization. And so instead of just looking at what the vulnerabilities are, what the CVSS score is, now we're maybe perhaps looking at how many of our devices have that application that's installed that, gives a larger footprint to the attackers. So maybe it's not a high score, but maybe we have this application or this operating system deployed throughout our organization and it's highly utilized. That may be a bigger risk. And so now we're prioritizing which vulnerabilities, because at some point, if you've been in vul management, you just have so many vulnerabilities that it becomes untenable to try to patch all of them. Now you have to prioritize which ones you have to do. And then in this phase, we were also looking at security groups security departments validating those risks and making sure that those patches were done. And that leads us to exposure management, because now we're looking at asset discoveries for all the things that we did before, but also certificates, SaaS apps, cloud infrastructure, data, supply chain, it continues on, and all these other things that we have today. And now instead of doing periodic scanning, we're going to do continuous assessment. So this is stuff that is linked in all the time, and you are just constantly looking at the data and updating the data. And now we're looking at reducing risk. Instead of just patching the vulnerabilities and prioritizing which ones, we want to look at the whole picture and see, based on these vulnerabilities, which ones we can patch in order to reduce the overall risk of something happening. And there's also business integration in this phase, looking at the applications that we're using as a business, the resources that we're using as a business, the critical assets that we have. And this is the evolution where it requires like a different line of thinking on how we address these weaknesses, how we prioritize true risk, and how we mobilize our teams in order to reduce it.
I think that's really helpful to go through that. How did we get here conversation? Because you mentioned like alphabet soup of acronyms. They all kind of start to sound like the same thing at a certain point. Oh, XSPM versus TVM versus RBVM. I mean, you can make them all up here. And they all kind of run together. And so what's security posture management versus security exposure management versus external attack surface management versus vulnerability management, risk-based vulnerability management? It's a lot. And so I like how you walk through that. And I think one of the drivers of this is complexity and growth in terms of our environments, and what we as security defenders are expected to secure has become exponentially greater. I know when I used to talk to customers about data security, so information protection, a lot of folks would get hung up on, well, we need to protect all our old data. We need to go back and crawl that and classify that. And the answer always was, yes, that's true. However, you will create more data in the next year than all the data your organization has ever created up till that point. It's an exponential growth problem, and it's hard for our human brains to understand that. And so the more effective way to protect the most in the least amount of time was actually to draw that line in the sand and start protecting things moving forward. Now, in this case, it goes from, when you're talking about the initial vulnerability management, we are patching pretty much everything, or trying to, at least. That was our goal. And as it became more of an untenable problem to patch everything, then we start saying, okay, well, what's the risk? How serious is this vulnerability versus that one? Let's go hit this one first. And then you talk about bringing in additional context over time. And you mentioned a couple of things, Andy. I'll add a couple more. Data security again, sensitivity labeling. If I have a bunch of highly confidential data on this server, I'm probably more interested in patching that environment than this one that doesn't host anything that's highly confidential. On the other hand, I could also look at how an attacker would move through the environment. And I'm blanking on the phrase for that, Andy, but where I'd map out
Attack path.
Attack path. Thank you. When I draw out an attack path and I can find ways to cut those off at the knees, those are also high value systems to maintain versus ones that may not be involved in a direct attack path to get to the crown jewels of your organization. And so those are all things we consider. And then again, moving to overall exposure management, just broadening that lens even further and not looking just at vulnerabilities, but adjacent things as well in terms of posture and risk reduction, integration into the business processes, all of those things you talked about. It really is an evolution. It's growth over time. It's maturity over time that led us from where we started to where we are today, or where we need to go tomorrow.
And I like to put this in terms of like an analogy, because I like analogies to help people
love analogies.
Visualize, right? So think of a house, right? We have a house that we need to protect. And so we're going to put security controls in place to secure that. We put locks on the doors, cameras, alarms, fences, all of that. But even with the best type of security that you have in place, new exposures will emerge over time that will put your security at risk. So for example, if someone lost the key, if they left open a window, if the garage door is left open, or the door was unlocked, or the security system wasn't enabled, these are exposures that even if you have the security features in place, they will provide a way for attackers to get in. So in order to make sure that your house isn't breached, you need to look at it from an attacker's perspective to discover all of the exposures with the highest breach likelihood and fix those as fast as possible to block the intruders. Now, imagine if you had a whole city to protect with multiple houses, and each house has its own type of exposure that can then put the entire city at risk. So each one has its own. Like one has a window open, the other one has a door open, the other one has a garage open. And so each one of these has their own exposure that needs to be mitigated. And that's what, if you don't have a good view of like which houses have the right exposures, all their relationships to each other, the current security measures, you're just going to like drown in this list of findings that you have, and you don't know what's important. And so that's where exposure management comes into place. You're getting that attacker's perspective and becoming more proactive around how you're going to protect your environment. And so exposure management, this program is governed by 5 phases. And I'm not going to like, go into super details. I just want to give an overview of what this 5-phase process is, which is called continuous threat exposure management. And that brings together the set of technologies to address that growing attack surface. So this continuous threat exposure management that has the 5 different phases, and this was born out of the challenges of vulnerability management to really look beyond just CVEs. It requires that shift in your thinking to, well, here's a patch that you need to fix by this deadline, to here's an exposure that is putting a critical asset at risk that needs to be mitigated immediately. It's that shift in thinking. And modern security posture management is about considering business goals, taking that attacker's perspective for risk, and embracing a proactive, continuous mindset. So this starts with scoping. The first stage is understanding your attack surfaces, what's important and what is less important to your business. And it could be an external attack surface, could be a new SaaS tool, could be an upcoming it could be third-party risks, but the scope will naturally expand and shift as your program becomes more established. The second one is discovery. So once you define your scope, you need to uncover all the assets and their level of risk. When you're considering risk, it's crucial to note that risk extends beyond vulnerabilities, such as misconfigurations, weak credentials, overly permissioned identities, legacy protocols, unprotected secrets, and so on. The third step is prioritization. You're never going to be able to fix everything. We've already said that, right? You're just going to drown in all of these different things. So this step is crucial because it's about identifying the most impactful issues, the ones with the greatest business impact, the greatest likelihood or lack thereof, leading to critical assets, and creating a plan to fix those first. The fourth step is validation. This is the stage that you look at how attacks can occur and the likelihood of their occurrence. This step will leverage a variety of tools with the goal of assessing if those assertions of the steps above are accurate and validated. And finally, mobilization. In the mobilization stage, you're looking at the entire framework and making sure that everyone is on the same page, understanding their roles and responsibilities within the context of the program, and finally doing the things that will mitigate the risk. And so that's just kind of a basis of how the exposure management program would work in this. And then we're going to provide you with the tool here, and we're going to go deep dive into the tool in a minute here. But that's how we would want you to scope a process in continuous threat exposure management.
There's not a lot to add here. Obviously, this has been pretty well vetted out. I will say the validation step stood out to me a little bit, looking at how attacks can occur and the likelihood of their occurrence. And this is still something we see a lot of times in cybersecurity, is folks chasing the shiny object or the new novel cool attack that they read about on Hacker News or Tech Meme or whatever. Sometimes it's just boring. Sometimes it's about covering your bases, doing the basics. I think about when, I'll use an analogy of my own, Andy, when Texas Hold'em became really popular in the early 2000s, 2003, 2004 timeframe, like when Chris Moneymaker won in 2003 and it became a big deal. And people grew up at that point learning about Texas Hold'em by watching it on television. Well, television is a television product. It's entertainment. It's edited to show the most exciting or interesting hands. But the thing is, to play winning Texas Hold'em, in reality, a lot of times you throw away a lot of hands or you fold a lot of hands, either pre-flop or when the flop hits. You're not playing them all the way to the river. You're not having these epic showdowns in every hand. You're just not. A lot of times you get dealt trash and you don't play it. And people who didn't understand this difference between a television product, which is exciting and interesting and generates a lot of eyeballs, and this analogy here to these websites, which again get paid by eyeballs, by attention, by advertising impressions, compared to what you actually do to play winning poker, or in this case, play winning cybersecurity, is doing really boring stuff over and over. It's folding, 10 deuce offsuit because it's terrible hand. Like, that's what you have to do. You have to do these basic boring things of folding a ton of hands until you get a hand that's worth playing, and then you can play it aggressively. And that's kind of cybersecurity too, is a lot of it is maybe kind of boring in the sense of we're doing the basics repeatedly and we're following these processes and this framework, and that sets us up so that when the exciting thing happens, we're prepared and we're ready to address it. And we haven't spent all of our resources chasing our tails on things that are ultimately not that impactful.
And I'm going to go a little out of order here on our notes because I want to just talk about real quick the licensing and data connectors because it's kind of important. I don't want to go into all of this before some of the listeners understand like how they can get a hold of this and light it up in their environment.
Yeah, good call. I like that.
So in order to really take advantage of security exposure management, one of the obvious things is that you have to be using the Defender security products. So you don't have to be using all of them, but obviously the more that you use, the better that your exposure management program is going to be, the more insights this tool within the Defender portal will give you. So at a bare minimum, you have to be using at least one of the Defender security products. That could be Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Identity, Defender for Cloud Apps, Defender for Office, Defender for IoT, Secure Score, which basically comes with essentially MDO Plan 1 or Microsoft 3 licensing. So you're going to get Secure Score with that. So, I mean, if you're an E3 customer, you're going to get at least Secure Score. Defender Vulnerability Management, Defender for Cloud, Entra ID, Defender Attack Surface Management. So there's a bunch of data connectors, and of course, more are coming. But right now, it's just tied to first-party data connectors for the most part. And the licensing requirements, again, it's just you have to be licensed for the Defender product. So any combination of E5, E3 with E5 security, Windows E5, EMS E5, if you're licensed specifically just for Defender for Endpoint or just Defender for Identity, like essentially you have to be licensed for one of the Defender products and have it deployed. And then the more you have, the better that the solution will be. And even like I said, Secure Score, if you're just using Secure Score with M365 E3 or A3, Defender for Office, Plan 1, those will light it up. One of the things that is not available today is, again, near and dear to my heart now because I work in the federal environment. It is not available for GCC, GCC High, or DoD Cloud yet. That is something that they're working on and will be coming hopefully soon. More to come on that when it gets announced. But right now, available for commercial. It is GA, so that's one thing to note. It went to GA, I think, back in maybe March or something like that, or maybe even earlier than that.
I think at Ignite actually last November.
Yep. Yeah.
And not a product, nothing to buy. There's no license for Microsoft Security Exposure Management. It's basically a platform that pulls together all these underlying things you may be paying for. But this is not an additional license. This is a no additional cost thing. It's included with your existing licensing. So not a sales pitch here, just a new capability available to you, a new portal that's been stood up that can help you bring together all these different viewpoints. And then, Andy, you mentioned mostly first party today. There is one third party tool that is supported currently. Rapid7 is supported here, and I believe we're working on more as well. But the goal is to make this not just a Microsoft dashboard, but a true extensible architecture that can bring third parties into it as you maybe use different solutions for your vulnerability management and you want to bring those in. And we will support those over time. So more to come there as well. The intention is for this to have that extensible architecture and be compatible with third-party solutions.
So let's talk about what you get in the portal. So when you go into the security portal, security.microsoft.com, if you are using that, you're going to have a new tab called exposure management. And this is going to be broken down into two different areas. One is going to be what we mentioned actually previously, Adam, attack paths, which is very similar to the attack paths in Defender CSPM, if you're familiar with that. But this is going to include all of your M365 data, Defender for Cloud, on-premise, hybrid resources, all of that into this attack path. And then also unified exposure insights. So those are the two main areas. In attack paths, this is really just a phenomenal tool for defenders. Attackers are always just looking for ways to infiltrate an organization, and they're always going to take that path of least resistance, right? And so defenders must look for all the possible paths to produce the true exposure of an organization. And currently, we have a lot of really good point solutions that are really good at exposing or assessing exposure at individual gates, like identity or devices or network or data or applications. But we really have a problem enumerating that over the entire path of, okay, well, this will link to this and this will link to this. And so this creates that silo effect that leaves an organization with a false sense of security. So like the identity folks are like, yeah, identity is secure. Device folks are like, yes, devices are secure. Server folks are saying, yes, the servers are secure. But maybe there's a vulnerability that will link them all together and we're not talking to each other. We don't see the bigger picture. And that's part of the shift, right? Defenders think in entities, they think in silos, whereas attackers think in paths. And as long as this is true, the attackers will win. And so what the attack paths in exposure management does is it helps close that attack path to critical assets with high likelihood of breach, high level of risk before it is exploited, and enables the security operations teams to mobilize and treat these attack paths as incidents. It also has another tab called potential choke points. This is just phenomenal stuff here, right? Like if I remediate this one vulnerability, it's going to prioritize these vulnerabilities. And if I remediate this one, it will cut off this many attack paths to this many critical targets. So it prioritizes your risk based on how many attack paths there are to how many critical targets there are, just based on the one thing that you could remediate. And so now you can work together to address those choke points, these top entry points and these top targets, and you can identify these single points of failure and maximize the impact of your proactive work. Now you might ask, what is a critical asset? That's a great question. Thank you for asking. It could be an identity that is associated with a privileged role, like a security administrator. It could be a VIP. We mark those VIP priority accounts in Defender for Office, and those priority accounts are also critical assets. It could be a server, like Adam, you said, with sensitive data. It could be a database. It could be a key vault. Could be a number of things that we actually have a whole list of predefined classifications for critical assets. And so these are already predefined. You don't need to go in and like mark them as critical. Like we do have ones that you can like priority accounts for MDO, but there's a lot of them that we just predefine based on our machine learning and classification to tell you whether or not this is a critical asset. And so attack paths will give you that. If this vulnerability is exploited, it will then work its way and it'll show you the whole path. It's going to do this, then escalate to this, this server, which will then, give you access to the domain controller, so on and so forth. So really good stuff there. Then we also have that unified exposure insights, which is more of a reporting tool where you're able to communicate that cyber risk management to, whoever. It could be your board. You can show measurable ROI for cybersecurity and strategic initiatives. If you're under like a CIO or a CISO, you're able to look at these metrics and effectively measure how good your cybersecurity initiatives are going and the ROI on that. You can monitor improvements and gaps. You have a strategic visibility over all of your exposures, and you can understand and communicate that cyber risk. If you're like a security or risk manager, you can now identify the risks with business priorities, identify exposure findings and contextualize them with organizational insights, prioritize urgency and criticality of the exposure, and then mobilize the teams to remediate them. Under the initiatives, you have current scores for each one of these different initiatives. So the initiatives that are listed under the exposure insights could be a business email compromise. So I have an initiative to secure my organization to defend against business email compromise. Or how is my cloud security? How is my enterprise IoT security? Ransomware protection. So each one of these initiatives, there's predefined initiatives that will then map to different vulnerabilities and different solution sets that will help you measure your current posture, and then provide you with steps to increase against that particular attack, attack vector. And so it'll look at each current score, the 14-day change, and then workloads that are assigned to it, like Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Cloud, or Entra ID, so on and so forth. And so you can see the changes. And these changes will happen all the time, right? Like if you're in vulnerability management, you'll know that like you're looking at your vulnerability management program and you're at like 70%, and then all of a sudden one day you're at 50%. Like what happened? Well, more vulnerabilities were released, right? And all of a sudden now you're at 50%. And so there's these metrics and events, and these events are really great because it shows you like if a new vulnerability comes out, okay, that's going to impact your score. But what else? That's not the only thing that's going to impact your score. What happens when the new TTP comes out? What happens if a new threat actor is out there based on our threat intelligence that's exploiting vulnerabilities that you have in your environment? Okay, now your score is going to go down too. And so these events within that exposure management insights will show you exactly what is impacting your score and then how you can go and improve that particular thing. So this is just phenomenal reporting if you're trying to proactively secure your organization. So this is a proactive thing, which helps in the fact that then you won't have to be reactive, right? And so if you're working on that vulnerability management, you have this great tool for exposure management to now give you all these insights, reporting, and then these attack paths to help you secure.
And it's all included. So it's modular, as Andy mentioned. So the different technologies, the more you have, the more will slot in, the more will highlight in the portal. But at the end of the day, there's for every single listener of this show, if you're at all a Microsoft 365 customer, whether you're E3 or E5 or somewhere in between, you probably can get some value out of this. And again, there's no additional cost. So it's worth it for almost everyone to go check it out after the show and see what insights you can get from here. But certainly this is part of a broader shift over time from how we used to handle vulnerability management to overall holistic exposure management today and tomorrow. And so that'll be, so many things are in cybersecurity, a journey, and we'll be with you every step of the way.
Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for listening as always, or watching on YouTube. Our contact information along with the link to exposure management will be in the show notes if you have any questions on how to use it, what it is, and it goes beyond what we talked about today. And then if you have any further topics you want us to talk about or questions, our email is there for you to email us. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.